Hello and welcome to Security Scan. I am Vishal Dahiya, and this week we will talk about India's defence exports. According to news reports, Ordnance Factory Board has recently received an order worth 315 crore rupees from United Arab Emirates to supply 50,000 artillery shells used with the Bofors guns. This is the largest ever single export order for the OFB, and it is considered as a big boost to India's plans to promote defence exports. In fact, India has set a target to reach 35,000 crore rupees annually in defence exports by 2025. According to the official data, the value of defence exports increased to 10,745 crore rupees in 2018-19 from 4,682 crore rupees in 2017-18. This figure was just 1,521 crore rupees in 2016-17. For this year, the target has been set at 15,000 crore rupees, out of which 3,471 crore rupees has been achieved till 31st of July. So what are the key policy initiatives to achieve the target, and how is it being implemented? And joining us for more on this is Mr. Sanjay Jaju, the Joint Secretary DIP, that is Defence Industries Production from Ministry of Defence. We also have with us Mr. Manu Pabbi, the Senior Editor of Economic Times, and Mr. Lakshman Kumar Behera, the Research Fellow from IDSA. Then let me begin with you, Mr. Jaju, to try and make our viewers understand as to what are we trying to convey here when we say that the defence exports are increasing exponentially, and the target has been set around 35,000 crore rupees. That's a huge mark if you look at last year's figures as well. And what are the key policy initiatives?
I think you would be aware that defence exports, unlike other exports, are controlled exports. It's not as if you can export freely to any part of the world. India is part of multilateral understandings like Wassenaar Arrangement. We're also part of the Missile Technology Control Regime. So as part of this, any export that goes out in this category, we call it as the munitions list, is to be cleared by the Department of Defence Production. And for that we have a standard operating procedure. So earlier I think we were not really focusing on export as one of the important items in terms of our defence production. And the numbers were...
The figures say so. Even 2 years ago, it was 1,500 crore.
And so the numbers were pretty dismal. And then we realized that defence exports have to be an important and integral part to promoting our defence production. So we brought out significant reforms in the standard operating procedure that is being followed.
Okay.
And the most important thing that we realized was the time that it used to take earlier for a defence export application to be processed within the department. So we brought in significant reform in the standard operating procedure. When the application was moving from one office to another, we cut down a lot of procedures, we cut down the red tape. For instance, I'll give you an example of a repeat order. Earlier, repeat order used to be circulated to all the stakeholders, even though the same order was cleared few months back. So we cut down that procedure. At the same time, for components, there were stringent requirements of end user certificates which were not necessary. So all those things were kind of sorted out. When an intra-company transfer was taking place from one company's subsidiary to its parent somewhere else, again significant procedural bottlenecks were there. So we removed all these bottlenecks, and the time that it used to take earlier was significantly brought down. For instance, an application used to take close to 6 months earlier, and now that process is being cut down to a month. In terms of the components, we are just giving applications being cleared in just about 10 to 15 days time.
Okay.
And you know, when you process applications faster, it becomes easy for the seller to negotiate with the buyer outside and clinch some of those orders. As a significant reform, we also brought in a portal wherein all the applications are being cleared seamlessly, an end-to-end portal. We have the industries who have registered on the portal, all the exporters who want to sell their products outside, and these registered exporters, when they file their applications online, we also transmit these applications online when we do the stakeholder consultation.
Okay.
So we receive the inputs also from all the stakeholders online, and then we give them a digitally signed certificate, and that also makes it completely without any incident of it being cleared out as a spurious material or some such thing. So when things happen this way, it becomes easy for an exporter to get clearances online, so he can then focus his energy on the business development, and I think which all the exporters have done and utilized this opportunity. And that's how you see that the exports, which were about 1,500 crores 2 years back, have now gone up to about 11,000 crores. It's almost a jump to 7 times.
And that is for the government to set the target for 15,000 crores for this.
And that's how we are looking at a $5 billion exports by 2024. That's 35,000 crores. And I know we need to make significant efforts, because right now what we're exporting are broadly the components. I think we'll have to start understanding that it's the platforms which are going to give us those numbers. So over the next few years, possibly we'll have to start focusing on the platforms and then move forward.
Okay.
Another significant thing which has happened is bulk of these exports which have come in last year have come in from the private sector. And I would say close to 90% of them have actually come in from the private sector.
That's another significant aspect of that, and we'll come to that also, and the bigger platforms also. Let me bring in Manu here first. Manu, how do you see this transformation which is taking place, this change, as Mr. Jaju put it, in terms of both the policy initiatives as well as making the entire process more streamlined, more, say, end-user friendly, in this term, those who want to export?
See, the thing is that Indian defense products are good, and there's lots of them. India is one of the largest defense forces in the world. So we consume a lot of military products, and what does it ended up doing is it has given us a lot of technology, not at the high end still, but at the lower to mid level, which can be used to export to other countries. The problem was twofold. The problem, one, was internal, because permissions were very difficult to get, a lot of paperwork involved.
The regime, basically.
The regime itself. Secondly, there was no promotion for you outside. So if I'm an Indian exporter who makes something good, there was no government effort to promote it, say, in shows abroad or a government-to-government level talks. For example, if, say, the Prime Minister is going to UAE, and the delegation is there, will they promote Indian products? That was not happening.
The way we usually see, the foreign countries doing it in Def Expos and places.
The Americans are best at that. They, the whole government machinery works for export because they see it as a part of their national strategy. So on both ends, work has started. One is, of course, what Mr. Jaju said earlier on the policy initiatives within the ministry to ease permissions. The other initiative that the ministry has done is also they've empowered defense attaches across the world, Indian defense attaches, to go and promote. I think you see the Indian government's presence in a lot more expos than they were before. So that top level push for defense exports is working out. The other big thing which I think really unlock exports for us in the coming years is we've extended these lines of credits to neighboring nations, friendly nations whom we want to build capacity, whom we want them to get stronger. And that potential, I believe there would be over $2 billion worth of LOCs which are pending. That can again be a huge thing for us to export, which is not only it's not only about making money, it's also about softer power, it's also about strategic, geostrategic policies in the region, which I think will have the potential of increasing this number. I think this number is very conservative, 35,000 crores. I think we will cross that for sure for 2024.
Okay, so that number, according to you, is conservative. Let's see how it goes about. Let me bring in Lakshman here. Lakshman, you've been, constantly keeping a watch on how the defense production scenario has moved in our country. Now, while the defense production itself has grown exponentially in terms of exports, if you look at the figures, till just about 3 years ago, it was just 1,500 crore odd rupees. But last year, it went up to 11,000 crore rupees. So how do you see the significant jump in terms of the defense exports out there?
No, defense export has done remarkably well. So now we have reached almost 13% of the total turnover defense production coming from exports. So still, I would say it is low compared to international standards. If you compare with other countries like Israel, for instance, generates more than 80% of the defense production turnover from exports. Like a country like France, it generates close to 40% of the turnover from exports. So we have reached on 13%, and target is to reach 35,000 crore, and which needs a significant push, as Mr. Jaju said. That we are exporting mostly the parts and components and few big platforms, being the helicopters and transport planes. And we need to export big platforms, be it fighter aircraft or tanks or maybe big warships. So that is where our focus should be. So we can do it because we are producing quite a lot. Our defense production turnover is around 80,000, more than 80,000 crore. So, and we are producing some of the big platforms. But the problem is that some of the items which we have designed and produced is not used in a huge number by our own armed forces.
Okay.
Take for example the LCA or your Arjun tank. So unless our armed forces accept those things, it would be very difficult to promote in the international market.
Okay.
So then that should be our focus.
So the focus should be moving from components to platforms, something Mr. Jaju was pointing out earlier, and bringing you back on that aspect. There are reports which suggest that the government is, trying to go ahead and tweak the rules in such a way that friendly nations can buy the weapons platforms altogether. So is that something which is in the pipeline? Are we moving ahead on that? Because you're also saying earlier that time is now come to move from components to the bigger platforms to give it a push.
Yeah, I mean, we have fairly world-class platforms, not just in our armed forces, but also in our defense production ecosystem. And it's not as if there is any embargo on exporting the platforms. The only thing is that you need to follow the regulations that you have, agreed to as part of the Wassenaar arrangement and any other multilateral agreement that we have signed.
Okay.
So there's no embargo on that. But of course, when you export a strategic platform, the most important thing that you'll have to bear in mind is its impact on the strategic imperatives of the country. So it's not as if it's if let's say it's a free for all, then possibly we could easily reach a 1 lakh crore target in this. I mean, but the fact
that's
is
not
that
possible in this sector.
But the fact is, yeah, in this sector we have to be very cautious. But these items are being produced to meet the strategic objectives of the nation. So it's not as if we can do it with complete impunity. It has to be done with a lot of controls, with a lot of consultation. So we are mindful of that. But we have also kind of, as was mentioned, for the first time come up with a directory actually of all the items that are available in the inventory of our country, in the inventory of our country's defense manufacturing system. And we have brought that directory out. We have classified it into the land systems, into the air systems, into the naval systems, electronic systems, and we have also put out all the components that we are producing, and then put that out in a small document, and the document is actually available on our website, and that is the document that we actually use when we talk to any friendly foreign country and tell them that, look, these are the items which are available, these are being used in our armed forces, and subject to the controls that we have, we are ready to export some of these items.
Okay,
so that's how we are looking at that.
Okay, so the idea is to go ahead and have that balance between the strategic objectives and also the ultimate aim to go ahead and increase that amount of defense exports. Manu, these two things needs to be a fine balance between these two objectives.
Definitely, and it has to come from political direction. What direction is the country going in? Which countries do we see as future partners? And there's no dearth of these countries. Look at where we have advantages. Our Navy is one of the finest navies in the region, perhaps the world. A bulk of the Navy is produced in India by our own shipyards, our own designers. So naval systems is one such place where you can really export a lot. We have countries like Myanmar, close by, Vietnam, Thailand, all our neighboring countries, Maldives, Mauritius, Mozambique. These are countries where we can export everything from like a small offshore patrol vessel to a frigate, to maybe even submarines in the future. So our strength lies in the fact that the Indian Navy and the Indian Armed Forces in the region are not looked as an expansionist force. They're looked as a force which gives peace, which is providing a security cover. So coming from India, those exports are also seen as more benign than perhaps they would come from some other country which has territorial ambitions. Secondly, look at the kind of platforms that we have which can be exported. A lot of them don't have really huge implications on national security imbalance in the region. For example, HAL is producing the HTT-40 trainer aircraft. It's a basic trainer. It's most likely going to be inducted. This can be sold to, say, a lot more countries more easily because it's not just a training platform. Similarly, you can have your helicopters, our advanced light helicopter, which is a non-armed one, which it has civilian applications also. So there's a lot of potential in which you can first, of course, ensure that strategically your objectives are met, but also the number of platforms available gives you enough of a market to really go beyond to whatever levels that you want to go to. Okay.
One more aspect to this here is the private companies, private industries, as well as PSUs. Let me bring in Lakshman here. Lakshman, as Mr. Jaju also put it, and the figures also clearly point out that the major stake in these defense exports is of the private defense companies. Now, how do you see this division between the private companies having their major share there, and how do you push further as far as our PSUs are concerned, DPSUs specifically?
Yeah, it's quite interesting actually. If you look at the private sector, they contribute less than 20% to our defense production, but they contribute more than 90% to our defense exports. So just imagine if a private sector is given a level playing field, and if their share in the defense production is at least 50%, and how much they will contribute to the defense exports. So private sector has the inbuilt incentive to look for the market and to export their products. But that incentive is not available with the PSUs or the OFB. So the figures actually clearly state that out of 11,000 crore, less than 10% comes from PSUs. No, but that is where our strength lies. The PSUs are historically the pillars of defense production, and we need to actually prod these giants that they need to augment production, they need to augment their exports. But the private sector has the greatest potential, but they don't have the big orders. They are not manufacturing our big platforms. So they are waiting for the big platforms, platforms or the orders from the MOD. And once they start manufacturing, they can export. We can't expect the private sector to export something for which there is no order from the Ministry of Defense.
Okay.
So we need to give level playing field as many orders to the private sector. Once they create some capability, so they can naturally look for the external market. As of now, their export is limited largely to the parts, components, and partly through offsets.
Okay.
So we need to allow private sector to manufacture big ticket items.
Okay, so what you're saying is that there is scope on both sides, both in private sector as well as DPSUs. Mr. Jaju, from the government's perspective, what is the kind of strategy or, maybe policy tweaks or initiatives which government might be looking at to ensure that the private sector gets a boost in overall defense production and the DPSUs, have more share in the defense exports?
Yeah, let me just supplement here. In fact, it's not as if we have kept the DPSUs out of this export umbrella. In fact, all the DPSUs have now been given a target that 25% of their turnover by 2024 has to come in from exports.
Okay, so you're saying that they're just getting started.
So, and this is a target. This is also part of the performance appraisal that's kind of done with all the CMDs of these organizations. So it's a pretty serious affair for them. They need to bring it up to 25%.
Okay.
Now, coming to the policy, yeah, the fact is, it's a huge market. I mean, we're just touching the tip of the iceberg. If you look at it, we have been a net importer, and in terms of defense equipments. So the time has now come that the manufacturing prowess that we have created, we utilize it not just for ourselves but for enhancing our defense exports, because that's also is going to give us the defense manufacturing ecosystem. And when you look at defense manufacturing ecosystem, we should also look at it as a larger part of the manufacturing ecosystem, which generates a lot of employment and which has a huge economic potential for the nation.
Okay.
So when it comes to private sector, now we look at both private as well as the public sector to be an equal partner in terms of our defense production pie. As was mentioned, out of 80,000 crore of defense production that we had last year, 20% of it, 16,000 crore, is actually coming from the private sector. And the rest of the public sector also outsources 40% of its work to the private sector. So if I put that together, almost half of our defense production is currently coming in from a big or an MSME private sector. So I think that's a significant shift if you look at where we have moved from 2001, where it was only public sector, to where we are today, where there's both public and the private sector coexisting. Coming again back to the export, the strategy that we have, as was mentioned by Manu as well, we are also looking at our defense attaches to play a huge role. We have created a small scheme wherein we expect defense attaches to be our eyes and ears for that particular market and keep giving us leads. In fact, in the export portal that we have created, where we do online permissions, we have also created a small window, because on the one side we have all the exporters who have registered. So there's a window that is called as a leads portal. So within the portal we generate leads, and these leads are generated by our defense attaches or by our delegations which go outside, or from our international cooperation division. And these are the people who generate these leads, and these leads are passed on to all the exporters in the country.
Okay.
You know what a private sector or a public sector or anybody who is trying to develop a market requires a lead. Once he has a lead, then he can develop that lead and create create his own way. So this is what is also happening in a very dynamic manner now, and most of the companies are utilizing these leads. And besides this, we are also looking at lines of credit. I think we have given ourselves a target of at least a $10 billion of lines of credit over the next 5 years. And if that happens, out of the 5 billion that we are looking at as the defense exports, 2 billion can even come in from the lines of credit.
The lines of credit.
There are huge opportunities, and we are not just looking at it from a very narrow perspective of giving out our platforms outside. We are looking at it from a wider perspective of creating a defense manufacturing ecosystem, and which we think is going to be of huge economic and employment potential for our nation.
Okay, so clearly creating a defense manufacturing ecosystem to go ahead and look at everything in that holistic perspective. But Manu, bringing you on that public sector and the DPSU's aspect, as Mr. Jaju put in, the numbers clearly point out how the role is being played by both of them. But as Lakshman was also pointing out, a bit more push to both the private sector and the DPSUs will make the process of achieving these targets much easier.
Definitely. I mean, if you see, if the potential of the PSUs is unleashed, then the exports can really touch any levels possible. The problem there is that, traditionally in the past, DPSUs were not incentivized to do this, and it takes an attitude change to get into this, and I think that change has just started off. And the other thing you're seeing is that a lot of our PSUs are getting listed. HAL is listed, some of our shipyards are listed, OFB is going through a corporatization process now. So these changes, even though they are taking time, I think once they are in place, and I believe that this should happen in the next 1 or 2 years, the PSUs will be more incentivized, they will be more geared to do exports. Look at the case of Indian companies. I want to take 1 or 2 examples. Look at L&T, for example. It's a private company, a lot of government shareholding also. They have been in defense for the past 20, 30 years. They are finally now manufacturing an artillery system in India, a full-fledged artillery system. Now this can be exported, but they planned in setting up the plant with the idea of export. So this kind of forward thinking sometimes is missing in PSUs, because they will only focus on the current order they have, and they'll only make capacities to cater for that. So I think that change in thinking has now started with, like Mr. Jaju mentioned about when they have targets of 25% exports, so they have to create the capacity and the manpower to cater for that. Look at companies like, say, Tata. They have been in defense for a long time, but remember, Tata is also a global company. They've acquired companies abroad. So in the next few years, if this is done properly, we can have Indian defense companies which will have a market, which can acquire defense companies abroad, which can go beyond just our confines. And India is seen very positively in this. A lot of nations will not be selling, say, a small defense company in a European nation to any other country, but to India, there is a certain benign, there is respect. We are seen as being following the international rules of the game of engagement. So that potential is going to get unlocked very soon.
Okay. Concluding words from you, Mr. Bera.
Yes, so defense export is very important, and we should follow the international best practices and norms. And there is no reason why we can't generate minimum 30% of our turnover from exports. And as others said, it's quite possible. And we need to actually incentivize both the PSUs and the private sector. And the public sector has a huge opportunities, and they have the real capacity as of now. They are manufacturing all the major platforms, be it aircraft or helicopter or tanks or ships. And so if they are asked to meet that target of 25% of the revenue, so it's quite possible.
Okay.
So yeah, we are on the right path, I believe. So, and actually, if you look at all the turnaround, the reasons behind, there are 2 major factors. One is political will, and the second is bureaucratic will. So those two aspects were missing earlier.
Okay.
So, and we need to actually have these probably we need to strengthen those 2 willpowers, and we'll achieve greater success.
Okay, so we are on the right path. Final word from you, Mr. Jaju, on the way ahead for the defense exports.
So it's pretty sanguine. I mean, we're looking at it with a lot of positive intent, and we think that it's important for our economy as well as for our security. It's also important that our companies get into the global supply chains and also become globally competitive. I mean, exports are not just needed for giving a pump priming to our economy. It's also required for ensuring that our companies are also on their toes. They produce quality stuff, provide value for money, and I think that's also is going to give us the technological edge which is so essential when it comes to any defense platform.
Okay.
So export as a tool to become competitive is also to be borne in mind, and we're fairly mindful of that.
And that's how the plan is. Manu?
No, I totally agree. And remember, defense industry is very, very high tech, and the advantage of that flow into a lot of other industries. And I think the more our private companies get stronger in this, the value will be seen much beyond just the defense sector. It will be seen in all manufacturing. So yes, this has to be the cornerstone of the Make in India policy, and there is no way for it to fail. It has to go ahead and be done right.
Okay, so clearly, as our panelists are pointing out, that the defense exports have to be seen in a holistic perspective. And the idea here is to go ahead and build a defense manufacturing ecosystem, also keeping in mind that the strategic objectives of our nation should be met. Clearly, we are on the right path, as has been pointed out earlier as well. And let's see how we move ahead and achieve those targets which have been set. We'll come again next week with a different topic and different set of guests. Till then, keep watching Rajya Sabha Television.
Hello and welcome. You're watching a brand new edition of India's World with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. India has said that it wants to see a strong, unified and prosperous ASEAN playing a central role in the emerging dynamic of the Indo-Pacific as it contributes to the country's prosperity and security as well. Addressing foreign ministers of the ASEAN member states in Bangkok, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar said India's engagement with the 10-member regional grouping has been and will remain a critical element of the country's Act East policy and strategy. Meanwhile, ministers from 16 Asia-Pacific countries of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership have said it is in the region's collective interest and highest priority to conclude the trade pact this year. RCEP is a proposed regional economic integration agreement among the 10 ASEAN countries and its 6 free trade agreement partners, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, China, South Korea and India. The final meeting of the RCEP will take place in Bangkok in November this year, and trade ministers are hopeful that the deal will be signed in mid-2020. On this edition of India's World, we will analyze all gamuts of the Indo-ASEAN ties as well as the RCEP. Joining me on the program today are Shivshankar Mukherjee, former ambassador, and also Jayant Das Gupta, former ambassador of India at the WTO. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India's World. Ambassador Shivshankar Mukherjee, I'd like to begin the program with you. Let's first try and take stock of Indo-ASEAN ties, because the foreign minister was there last week and he held several multilaterals and was part of several conferences as well. How did you think that went?
Well, it's a given that our relationship with ASEAN, which was always very important over the last few years, over the last decade or so, I would say, has reached a point where its overall importance politically, economically, and in every way is self-evident. Our trade with the ASEAN countries is over $80 billion, and almost everybody is agreed that that does not even scratch the potential. These are countries which are not international basket cases or anything like that. These are countries which are economically resurgent. They are as I said, in our backyard. So commercially and economically, they are of extreme importance. Politically, in terms of all the developments leading to our biggest foreign policy, which is China, and therefore our interaction with ASEAN countries is very much connected with that, with all the developments connected with the Indo-Pacific. and the balancing act that is going on vis-a-vis China again, and the US and other countries in the ASEAN and their commitment to, you know, the keeping the Indo-Pacific and the oceans, you know, committed to freedom of the seas and security. So our, you know, the foreign policy of India in terms of looking east and now acting east, as the slogan goes, is, I would say, of enormous importance. I mean, there's, you can adduce reason after reason, including, which is not, you know, sometimes, which is not often mentioned in the discourse on this. There's a very large Indian diaspora in these countries, not all the countries, but many of them. So if you consider every sector of human endeavor and national endeavor, ASEAN looms large on our horizon.
Absolutely.
And the meetings, I'll simply end by saying, if you look at the meetings that Minister Jaishankar had to go through, I think it was 2 summits, 4 conferences, and more than 18 bilateral meetings. That itself shows that, you know, across the board, our relationship there, individually, bilaterally with the individual countries, as well as with ASEAN as a whole, is of preponderant importance.
Absolutely. That having been said, Ambassador Dasgupta, you know, there's no doubt that the relationship is extremely important, but there's also another aspect to it, like touched upon by Ambassador Shivshankar Mukherjee, the fact that there is so much more potential really as far as this, you know, interaction is concerned. What is the problem really? Why hasn't it seen the heights that it should have?
I think there are a few factors. The first one is a lack of, let's say, overland connectivity and flights, direct flights, barring a few, like of course we have flights to Singapore, to Thailand, to Malaysia. But that is also another constraint which has been faced. The third issue is about language, and that, you know, especially in terms of the information technology enabled services and information technology, which we are trying to overcome by having people pick up another language which is used locally in many of the ASEAN countries. So these are the 3 factors, and of course then comes the issue of the overwhelming influence of China in the last 20 years or so, because of the investment flows that have taken place from China, and as a consequence many of the countries like Thailand, Malaysia, to a certain extent Indonesia, and of course to a very large extent Vietnam, they have become a part of the global value chain with its core lying in China. So that has enabled China to strike deeper relations with them on the economic front, trade front, and to that extent India has not really been able to fulfill its potential.
Correct. So that having been said, Ambassador Mukherjee, you know, can we overcome China's influence in the region, or we don't have to at the end of the day? Can both India and China coexist there?
Well, I think the latter part of your question is something that almost is inevitable. We will have to coexist there. I cannot, this whole business of playing catch up with China, I hear that in conversations vis-a-vis our policy in Africa all the time, ASEAN, wherever. We, I think, make a mistake in simply concentrating our commercial policies, our economic policies, perhaps even our foreign policies to support these policies in terms of what China is doing and therefore catching up with China. I think that's a losing kind of, that's a counterproductive perception. We have certain endowments, we have age-old relationships, we have you know, we have certain strengths in certain sectors, and we should capitalize on them. We should continue to base our policies on our strengths instead of simply reacting to you know, what China is doing in particular sectors and so on. I mean, I don't think that's the right basis for formulating policy. China's size, its deep pockets, its aggressive policies in recent years are a reality. Its growing influence in the world because of its growing economic and commercial, its money power, sheer, it's in most countries, especially in Africa, for instance, as one of my colleagues put it, China is the only cash-rich game in town. Even the West, the so-called developed West, is not being able to match it in terms of its willingness to offer concessional credits and loans and grants and aggressively push its commercial agenda. Therefore, I think to reach our real potential with ASEAN, we have to follow the traditional methods of improving our economic and commercial interaction. We have to be more competitive. Our private sector has to be encouraged and incentivized. I mean, it's all those traditional methods which we have to implement with greater efficiency. Instead of simply, looking out at what China is doing and then trying to play catch up with it.
Right. So, talking about traditional ways and traditional aspects that we need to concentrate on, are there any specific sectors going forward that we need to concentrate on as far as ASEAN is concerned, where both the ASEAN as a bloc and India can benefit?
Talking about the economic relations, I think, for one thing, there is a great deal of scope for tourism. And in fact, ASEAN already provides us with a large number of tourists, especially on the Buddhist circuit. So there are enormous opportunities there, and that has not really been fully exploited. That is one. The second aspect is about education. Many of the students from the ASEAN countries still go to Australia, New Zealand and the UK, US, for instance, for higher studies. If we could tap that by setting up, and we have taken an initiative in the form of these institutions of excellence, if this really comes up within the next few years, that could provide us with an opportunity. The third aspect is again in the case of services, where professional services like law, for instance, or accountancy or auditing, these could be leveraged, because India has certain strength in all these services. And then, of course, in medicine, in architecture, in engineering, because there is a shortage in some of the ASEAN countries, at least, in terms of skilled professionals in these areas. So this is as far as services is concerned. And then in trade in goods, we have to see the complementarities, because in many cases ASEAN has a very similar kind of a basket of products, especially in the last few years. The way Vietnam has come up, we can see that it is matching India in most of the products that India is producing. So we have to look for complementarities, and we have to get into a value chain arrangement with the ASEAN countries to leverage our plus points, our strengths, and see where we can fit in and lead to a synergy which will be a win-win kind of a situation for both.
Right. So, Ambassador Mukherjee, you touched upon this particular aspect in your opening statement, the Indo-Pacific, and how the US and India are both, heavily invested on the Indo-Pacific idea and everything that's happening there. From that perspective, how strategically important is ASEAN?
I would say extremely important from every point of view. The economic underpinning of the importance of ASEAN and Indo-ASEAN relationship is self-evident, as I said. I mean, it's not for nothing that we invited all the ASEAN leadership to our Republic Day parade as a symbol. It's not for nothing that we have an annual Indo-ASEAN summit. And if you look at the geopolitics of the area and the whole route that international trade follows from the east to the west and vice versa. I mean, that one look at the map will show you the enormous importance of India straddling the middle of that area, with global interaction, particularly in trade across the seas, which is why the security parameters, all the entire concept of security, maritime security in the Indo-Pacific region assumes importance. I mean, how we go about it, with whose partnership, how we, the elephant in the room again being China. This is really the challenge that our foreign policy faces. That's on the political side. Also, these are countries that are but China, and these are not, these are not small insignificant countries. These are countries with significant commercial and economic and political clout, and together ASEAN is a reasonably formidable political combination. In fact, they have achieved a kind of economic coordination and unity, and based on that, a certain amount of, not as much, but certainly a significant amount of political, approach to things, which makes it one of the most successful groupings in the world. So to have them as friends is in, as I said earlier, is in India's national interest in every sector, in the political, security, and the commercial and economic sectors. So I mean, there are no two arguments about it. The point is, how do we, I think Jayant pointed out certain specifics to the generalities that I had mentioned. If you look at the commercial area, there's so much. I was talking about of moving forward on the natural endowments that we have, the opportunities that we have, rather than play catch up in this or that area with China. He mentioned tourism, education, medical tourism. There are a whole variety of areas, particularly in services and IT and so on, in which we stand in which the potential is very, very high and not really been achieved. So more focus on those areas. Connectivity, which is absolutely key to movement in every area, including, and let's not forget, in the political area. Connectivity leads to all sorts of things in terms of bringing us closer together and sorting out problems in more people-to-people interaction, more trade, a whole lot more comfort with each other. I mean, the highway between India, Myanmar, and Thailand, is a case in point. So I think what needs to be done is known. It's a question of doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, moving on now from the Indo-ASEAN relationship to, of course, another important, meeting that took place over the weekend, that of the RCEP. Ambassador Dasgupta, your thoughts on the negotiations at the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in Beijing?
There has been considerable progress in terms of concluding 7 of the 18 chapters and 3 of the annexes, which are financial services, telecom, and 1 more. But the elephant in the room is the issue of finalizing the goods part, the services part, and the investment part. The main problems that India looks at is about access, providing access, but not getting reciprocal access. India at the moment is having a trade deficit of approximately $106 billion with respect to the other 15 countries in RCEP, of which approximately $54 billion is with respect to China alone, about 12 vis-a-vis Korea, and about 10.5 vis-a-vis Indonesia, 4.7 in respect of Singapore, 3 for Thailand, etc. Now, of course, the others are not very significant because in the case of Korea, for instance, a lot of investments are taking place in India in terms of electronics, in terms of cars, other things, other industries. Indonesia, a large part of it is on account of import of raw materials. So that also could be factored in. But the main problem is that our deficit vis-a-vis China has been growing. And while we are still exporting mostly primary products like iron ore and some agricultural products of late, China has been exported finished products, and we have not been able to have market access, along with the removal of non-tariff barriers in many areas, including pharmaceuticals, dairy products, other agricultural products like soybean, etc. And there is also a problem in respect of getting adequate access in information technology and other services. And finally, there is a problem about getting visas, business visas for China. Even when we want to transact business with our Chinese counterparts, there is a problem. So all these issues have been raised last week by the Indian Commerce Secretary with the Chinese Vice Trade Minister, and hopefully these will get addressed. But as long as there is this huge looming deficit which is increasing every year, there will be reservations on the part of India to get into an agreement. And finally, I must mention that India wants to have a 15-year phase-out period, whereby we get adequate comfort to bring our duties to zero. And India wants to carry out the tariff liberalization in about 80% of the tariff lines, and 74% for China and the other non-ASEAN partner countries. But the Australians, for instance, they want 90%, and they want a much shorter phase-out period for the tariffs. So there are differences even within the group, outside of the differences existing between India and China.
Sure.
So these are some major issues which we will have to overcome before we see the conclusion of the agreement.
All right. So the trade ministers, Ambassador Dasgupta has pointed out all of the issues really as far as RCEP are concerned very beautifully. The trade ministers, however, want the deal to be done and the negotiations concluded by the end of this year, because they have said that it is in collective interest and it's the highest priority. Do you see that happening, considering there are so many differences? Because not just India and China, even Japan and South Korea have differences and so on and so forth. So do you see that happening?
I would very much like to defer to Jayanto on this, because he has dealt with the problem. He's the expert on the subject. My feeling is, in terms of having been involved in negotiations with elsewhere, I don't think it's going to be easy. Certainly not everyone in this group of 16 has the kind of enthusiasm, the statement you referred to about giving it the highest priority. And but more importantly, as far as India is concerned, Ambassador Dasgupta pointed out very, very specifically what are our problems. Basically, there's one more that I am aware of, which these specific instances actually give more examples to, which is that the Indian industry, the big players and the medium-sized players in India, in terms of manufacturers, in terms of traders and so on, are all ranged against the RCEP. I saw a news report which talked about the Commerce Minister, Piyush Goyal, having interactions with, with our commercial players in every sector prior to this RCEP meeting in China, where in every single meeting he was met with a huge kind of opposition to the RCEP by the Indian businessmen, because of just one factor, which is this feeling that they have that India would be swamped with Chinese goods if we had more free trade agreements such as RCEP. Now, I frankly, without being an expert on this, I frankly would tend to feel that this needs greater examination. After all, when we liberalized in 1990, 1991, because we were almost forced to do so, what actually happened was a complete positive change in the Indian economy, our mindset. Liberalization led to, I would say, a new India with the departure of the license quota Raj. And therefore, the fears of the Indian businessmen is always there in terms of foreign competition coming in, and yet when these things are done, our businessmen, our industrialists, our economic players learn to compete, they learn to compete globally, and good things happen to the country. But quite apart from this aspect, about wanting to take our own businessmen along, which seems to be a little difficult, the main difficulties are what he pointed out, which is I think we are not very happy about the amount of market access we are getting, particularly with China. We have a fear that if as we bring our tariffs down, our terms of trade with the remaining countries will actually get worse, not better. Whether this is actually true, I really can't say, but this appears to be one among our apprehensions.
Right. So, closing comment from you, Ambassador Das Gupta, on the best way forward as far as this particular issue is concerned.
I think the RCEP negotiations are extremely important from India's point of view, because it will enable us to access a large number of markets. Of course, the additionality would be, in strictly speaking, in terms of China, Australia and New Zealand, because we have FTAs with ASEAN and with Japan and Korea in any case. But it will also enable us to be part of the global value chain, because 30% approximately of global trade originates in this region. So it would give us a leg up in terms of gaining global competitiveness, and in terms of course, technology transfers, in terms of investment flows. So this is something which we can't ignore. Right. But we have to look at our position, and the point that Ambassador Mukherjee made, that is very well taken, that with liberalization comes greater competitiveness in the domestic industry, but you have to create conditions suitable for enhancing our competitiveness. And I think now the time has come for making some very urgent reforms, taking some steps in that direction, and addressing those issues, which will give comfort to our own industry, make them competitive, and enable them to face up to challenges from the ASEAN plus China.
All right. On that note, then, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of India's World. Thank you to both my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it on this edition of India's World, but we'd like to hear from you as well. Do share your feedback with us. Our email ID is indiasworld.feedback@gmail.com. You can also tweet to us using our Twitter handles at FRP09 and at Rajya Sabha TV. That's it. See you again next time.